Good evening and welcome. Our program tonight, The Future of Marijuana Policy in Texas, is brought to you by the Houston Chapter of NORML, National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. I'm your host, Jason Miller, and we're joined here tonight by a live studio audience and an all-star lineup of special guests. We'll be with you for about the next hour and a half talking about cannabis in the state of Texas and local policies here in Harris County. Toward the end of our program, we'll be taking questions from our audience, so write down your questions and we'll hear them later tonight. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize and congratulate someone in the room here with us tonight. Someone who's volunteered for our organization for many years and has served on our board as our deputy director and our veterans outreach director, and someone who has served our country as a U.S. Army specialist. And just this past week at the Houston Astros game, our very own Christopher Sum was recognized for his service and awarded with the Chevrolet's Everyday Hero Award and surprised with a brand new car. So we have a clip.
Chevy Military Night here at the ballpark, a special moment for Houston area Chevy dealers and Military Warriors Support Foundation. They honor the Chevrolet Everyday Hero for his service and sacrifice today. It's Christopher Sum, Army Specialist. They presented him with a brand new car.
So Chris, what was going through your mind when they pulled up with that car?
I was so shocked because I was so worried about not hitting the dirt when I was throwing the pitch, because everybody was kind of don't hit the dirt when they threw the car, and it threw off my whole game. But everybody said I did good, so it worked out fine.
Okay, good. Well, congratulations and thank you for your service and for everything you've done for Houston NORML.
Yeah, I'm so proud to be part of this organization, and thank y'all for coming out tonight. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'd like to go ahead now and introduce our guests for the evening. To my left, Kim Ogg began her legal career working for the Harris County District Attorney's Office, where she attained the level of Chief Felony Prosecutor. She was appointed as Houston's first Anti-Gang Task Force Director, and she's a former Executive Director of Crime Stoppers of Houston. She's board certified in criminal law by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization, and Kim Ogg is the Democratic nominee for Harris County District Attorney. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Jason.
Representative Harold Dutton is the current state representative for House District 142, where he served since 1992. He chairs the House Juvenile Justice and Family Issues Committee. He received his BBA in accounting from Texas Southern University and his law degree from Texas Thurgood Marshall School of Law. He's authored and co-sponsored legislation to reduce the penalties for misdemeanor marijuana possession. So thank you, Representative Dutton, for being on our program.
Well, thank you for letting me be here. I just want to make one correction. I've been there since 1985.
1985.
Yes.
Wow, okay. And next we have Ed Gonzalez, earned his bachelor's in criminal justice from the University of Houston downtown. He served 18 years with the Houston Police Department and rose to the rank of sergeant. He served 6 years on the Houston City Council, where he chaired the Council's Public Safety and Homeland Security Committee. Ed Gonzalez is the Democratic nominee for Harris County Sheriff. And thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Jason.
Representative Gilbert Pena is the current state representative for House District 144, elected to this seat in 2014. He graduated from Texas Southern University with a bachelor's degree in political science. He and his wife have lived in Pasadena since 1992. They have 4 children and 6 grandchildren. And thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Jason.
I want to start with talking a little bit about NORML for our viewers who may not be familiar with our organization and our mission. And this will set the foundation for what we're going to be talking about throughout the program. Founded in 1970, NORML is a 501c4 nonprofit organization seeking to move public opinion sufficiently to legalize the responsible use of marijuana by adults and to serve as an advocate for consumers to assure they have access to quality products that are safe, convenient, and affordable. The Houston chapter of NORML was founded in 1989, also a 501c4 nonprofit organization. For me personally, I believe that cannabis is a gift with many legitimate uses and real benefits for a lot of people. We can use the plant for good and we can use it responsibly. Now, there are some negative aspects to marijuana's misuse, and we can talk about that. However, none of those aspects justify prohibition, not even close. Prohibition is a failed policy, a destructive policy, and a widely unpopular policy. And ultimately, I don't believe that simply decriminalizing possession or allowing for medical use only is the answer. Now, those reforms would certainly be a step in the right direction, and we do support that. But I feel that the only real solution is to repeal prohibition altogether, stamp out the black market, and allow legitimate businesses to provide safe products with age restrictions and consumer protections. We're seeing this succeed in Colorado, Washington, Alaska, Oregon, and possibly up to 6 more states later this year when voters head to the polls in November. Now, locally, people will also be voting in November for each of our guests who are here with us tonight, who are running for office. And I want to just start with my first question for our guests. How do you feel about this issue personally, and why do you think it's important? And Kim Ogg, we'll start with you.
Well, about 12,000 people a year in Harris County are arrested for misdemeanor possession of marijuana. It's a cost of about $10 million to taxpayers. All 12,000 get a permanent criminal record that is never wiped clean, and it hinders job opportunities, education, and housing. And when there's so much crime out there that's really hurting people, it's a waste of prosecutors, police, and tax dollars to continue to jail people in simple possession of a misdemeanor amount of marijuana.
Great, thank you. Representative Dutton?
Well, I could say just amen to everything that Kim just said, because I agree with everything she said. I got started on this because I was in a court down in Harris County, and one of the judges came to me and said, "Harold, come here, I want to show you something." And I went over, and he started to show me his docket for that day. He had 12 cases of marijuana possession, all with quantities that were probably less than an ounce. He said, "I don't like doing what I'm going to have to do to these people. Most of them are going to get probation, but they're going to have to lose their driver's license for a year. They're going to have to go through having a probation officer, for 12 months. We're probably not going to give them that much of a fine, but then they're going to have a criminal record. And I really think you all ought to do something about it." That was back in 2003. And so I started then taking a look at it and decided that the way marijuana laws work in Texas now, based on the punishment is related directly to the quantity that you have, all the way from a first-degree felony all the way down to state jail felony and all the way down to a Class B misdemeanor. But it cuts off at a Class B misdemeanor. And so what I did is propose legislation that would take it, at least for an ounce or less, it would be simply a Class C misdemeanor, and you'd get a traffic ticket, like a traffic ticket for it. Now, some people said, well, that's decriminalize it. I said, well, I don't see very many people volunteering for a traffic ticket, so I don't think it decriminalizes anything.
Eddie Gonzalez?
Well, Jason, I'm running for the office of sheriff simply because I believe we need to reform a criminal justice system that's broken in many ways. And I believe the simple issue of mass incarceration. We spent $80 billion per year in this country incarcerating people, and we still have crime. And I think that in the law enforcement arena, I think we veered from the path that we should be on, which is going after true criminals. I want to find out who's committing the sexual assaults, who's committing the burglaries, who's committing the robberies. Those are the things that I think law enforcement should be focusing on. Instead, we try to do things that, frankly, there's not a law enforcement solution for. There's not a law enforcement solution for a number of things such as poverty, mental illness, addictions. And so we've got to think outside the box. One of the things that I proudly did while I was on city council was the creation of the Houston Sobering Center, where we no longer incarcerate folks for public intoxication. No criminal records created. We just go and basically let them sleep it off for a few hours and hopefully connect them to a recovery coach if that's what they need. If not, they go on about their way. And we hope that they don't come back. So it's reduced the cost on taxpayers, and we feel created more effective results. And there's a number of things we could do that. And I think that marijuana usage or the possession of marijuana is another area that we definitely need to decriminalize. I would run a very costly jail, and one of the reasons it's costly is just because we can't manage the population that we have. That's why the cost of overtime right now is having to pull monies from other mission-critical operations at the sheriff's office into simply detaining people because they can bond out or they're in there for minor offenses. So we need to change that. It's not right. The war on drugs has been a failed policy for over 40 years. We tried it. It didn't work. We need a new direction.
Thank you. And Representative Pena?
Well, I grew up with that stigma from my parents that, drugs are bad for you, don't do them. It's something that I'm hearing a lot about now as a state rep, first time. And so I'm asking people, well, how do y'all feel about it? Should it be legalized? Should it not be legalized? And my district being 74 or 75% Hispanic and coming from Mexico, they're kind of afraid of it being legalized. They're kind of looking at it and saying, if you legalize it, what's going to happen here? We come from a country where it's illegal and there's corruption all over the country, especially along the border. There's killings and so forth. And so they're afraid of it. Is that what's going to happen here? So I try to explain to them, well, no, we're going to try to police it. We're going to try to control it. We're going to try to make it as to where it's being only provided to those who need it, whether it's medical or recreational. How do you feel about it? Well, I'm still on the fence about it. So they're waiting to see what's going to happen, and so I want to try to work on it a little bit more and see what's going to happen.
Okay, thank you. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
So I want to talk now a little bit about a local issue, an individual case that occurred here in Harris County last year. This is the Sharnisha Corley case. And I would like to talk about this. A young woman was pulled over for running a stop sign, suspected of smelling like marijuana, and then cavity searched in a gas station parking lot. Now, last year, as an organization, we were very vocal about this, calling for a criminal investigation into the individual deputies. And there have been multiple news reports on this, and now there's a federal lawsuit. And the dash cam video, I have not seen, it's not public, but it has been described to me by her attorney, and he's described it to the Houston Press as well. And what's been described to me, I'm going to just go ahead and read directly from the lawsuit itself, because what's been described to me is pretty much the same as what's written in this lawsuit. And this is a federal lawsuit against the county, and I'm just going to read this one part. It says, when one of the deputies tried to insert her fingers into Miss Corley's vagina, Miss Corley protested. At that point, the deputies forcibly threw Miss Corley to the ground while she was still handcuffed, pulled off her pants, pulled down her pants with her legs spread apart, threatened to break her legs, and without consent penetrated her vagina in a purported search for marijuana. The deputies kept Miss Corley pinned to the ground and half naked for approximately 11 minutes. At 11 minutes, and that's what her attorney spoke about. That's in the dash cam video. So I want to ask about this issue because I feel it's important, and I also want to just talk a little bit about something that's happened more recently as well. The two deputies were indicted on charges of official oppression, and what's really, really disturbing about this is Harris County Sheriff Ron Hickman put out a press release and accusing the DA's office basically of coming forward with this indictment just based only on news reports and not based on facts. Well, we know the evidence presented to the grand jury was real evidence. There was a video and everything else. We haven't seen that evidence, but it was just ridiculous that he basically said, well, there was an internal affairs investigation and we've already determined that they didn't have any wrongdoing. So he's attacking the district attorney over these two indictments. And this, by far is the lowest of the low of anything I have ever seen from a Texas sheriff. He actually got defensive about the fact that two deputies were indicted and decided to whine and cry and throw a temper tantrum over this. And I'm just completely floored by this. The DA's office then put out a press release and said that prosecutors felt the search was shocking and offensive. She said the sheriff's response was disappointing on many levels. So I want to ask Ed Gonzalez, you're running for sheriff. You want to be the next sheriff of Harris County. What is your reaction to these indictments, and what do you think about the way the sheriff's office has handled this so far?
Well, I condemn Sheriff Hickman for his response. I think it was very inappropriate considering lack of respect for the grand jury process and the fact that it had been vetted. And I think that he should have had more compassion for Ms. Corley, considering what she went through. I would have immediately, if anything, said, we're going to review our training. We're going to work to correct this to make sure it doesn't happen again. Number one, it's illegal. And then secondly, it's to do it out in a public parking lot is doubly offensive. I mean, it wasn't even behind closed doors somewhere, in a controlled environment, if you will, just out in a roadway in a parking lot. Just again, very offensive. And so I would make sure that those type of issues do not happen and that we hold everyone accountable. And if somebody's wrong, then we have to call them out on it. The response is not surprising, though, because many other failings within the sheriff's office, it's always somebody else's fault. It's a failure of taking ownership and being accountable. And that's why I think it's important to bring new leadership. And I'm glad that there's a new era of leaders coming forward that are willing to have that kind of mindset and really not be afraid to tackle these issues and to truly represent the citizens of Harris County.
Thank you.
Can I just add
Yes.
this? I'm going to make an admission here. I felt responsible for what happened. Let me tell you why. There had been 2 other prior cases where a female was stopped on a traffic and officers had engaged in that kind of conduct, one in Dallas and one in Houston. As a result, I filed a bill making that against the law. The only thing I didn't do, though, was the law took effect on September 1. Now, I had no idea that law enforcement would continue to act like that, and so we have a way in which we could have made it effective immediately. And I think I could have gotten everybody in the legislature to give me that vote to make it immediately, because when I introduced the bill, everybody was shocked by it. People were saying, Harold, they don't really do this. I only had one officer come to me who was actually against the bill. One of the other officers, one of the HPD officers, said, he's crazy for being opposed to this bill. We like the bill because no self-respecting officer would engage in that kind of conduct. And so when I say I feel responsible, I really should have made the bill effective immediately, because I think what happened to Ms. Corley happened in August, a few days before that bill would have taken effect. And so now that's against the law for a police officer to do that on the side of the road, and particularly without a warrant, because all of these were warrantless searches where they were stopped for traffic. Police officer says, well, I smell marijuana, and then it goes downhill from there. And so it's amazing to me that we in the legislature, though, have to tell police officers some of these things, because it makes fairly common sense to me. Why would you stop somebody on the side of the road and then engage in, and in the other 2 cases, the two women were together in Dallas, and the officer used one glove and inserted the glove in one, and the other one said, "Why aren't you going to get another glove?" She says, "No, I don't need to do that." So he took that glove and used it on the other female. It's just, like I said, it makes no sense that the legislature has to tell police officers that kind of a conduct ought not to be allowed in law enforcement.
Right. You'd think the Fourth Amendment itself
Would say that, yes,
that they
would
would
be
understand
sufficient.
that, and it's unfortunate. And Ed Gonzalez, you mentioned a controlled environment, and I've heard similar things from people in law enforcement. And when I asked Sheriff Hickman about this, he said something along those lines of, well, if they're going to do a search like this, they can go to police station or to the county jail. And I'm just like, no, dude. I don't care if you go to an underground CIA bunker. You don't search someone's genitals for marijuana. Like you can't do that, like, ever. So I was just very, very shocked, very floored by this, that we're not talking about somebody in prison who's already lost their freedom that, might have a weapon and harm other inmates. No, we're talking about a free citizen who has Fourth Amendment rights. But in your opinion, as far as how you would talk to your deputies and train your deputies, do you feel that someone who smells like marijuana has a Fourth Amendment protections?
Yeah, I mean, we're a country based on the rule of law, and I think that we have to be mindful of that. I mean, and just the simple odor. I mean, we've got to just be very cautious that we don't start intruding into other aspects of their freedom without getting a warrant or having, a probable cause of really developing a strong case. And again, I hope that we could move towards where law enforcement gets away from having to even enforce some of these things, because again, I don't think it's the proper use of our resources and what we should be focusing on. Again, I would rather focus on other crimes and reducing the backlogs that we have when it comes to unsolved sexual assaults, the backlog of burglary cases, and a lot of other things that are pending simply because we don't have the resources to go after.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the grand jury indictment of the officers, Kemal, can you enlighten us a little bit about the grand jury process and how that investigation and how those proceedings work?
The grand jury is a constitutional right that anybody accused of a felony has the right to have regular citizens determine if there was probable cause, if the officers had probable cause to believe that a crime had been committed, and in this case, to determine whether the officers themselves committed a crime. So they're the ones who enjoyed that grand jury right. The missing link here is that before an officer can arrest somebody, and granted this search happened before the arrest, she was detained, but she was officially arrested when an assistant district attorney at intake was presented the facts of this case over the phone, as is the current standard procedure. As you can imagine, details can be left out, but at the end of the day, a lawyer whose job it is to review the evidence and the actions of the officer and the accused signed off on these charges. And these charges were pending long after the accusation had come to the attention of the district attorney herself and the sheriff himself. And so while prosecutors stated in the paper that they were shocked, no one from the district attorney's office moved to dismiss this case earlier or to investigate the officers earlier. And I think what it shows is a district attorney's office that is out of touch with regular people. It's clear that invasive searches into our bodies require a search warrant. It's also likely, I would hope, that no judge in town would sign such a warrant. But if they did, that would be up to their independent determination and review. But the district attorney in this instance waived the need for a judge, did not tell the officers they needed a search warrant, approved the charge against the woman, and she went to jail, went to court, had to hire a lawyer, went to great expense after public humiliation, and now is only able to get relief by bringing a federal civil rights lawsuit against the county. And let me say, for one individual to sue the government is very, very difficult, and very few lawyers do it because it's expensive and difficult. So it's hard to get even relief when you're entitled to it. So the idea that the grand jury indicted these officers makes perfect sense to me. It's just that the district attorney's office, instead of waiting months to hold those officers accountable, or at least to bring their case in front of the grand jury, could have stopped the injustice that night. They didn't. But it's important that you remember this is the same district attorney who has been jailing innocent rape victims who are simply witnesses. So I guess it shouldn't shock our conscience, but it does mine.
I was just going to add, the reason I said it makes sense is, how much marijuana could you find examining somebody's body cavity?
Well, and we weren't at the time even prosecuting that small of an amount of marijuana,
Yeah.
because of the first chance program.
And that's what so offends the notion that law enforcement would engage in that kind of conduct. I mean, you're certainly not going to find a pound of marijuana examining someone's body cavities. I mean,
And you're not going to get a search warrant, Jason, for a misdemeanor.
absolutely. That's exactly.
And so this was an illegal search. The officers knew it was an illegal search. The district attorney should have known it was an illegal search.
Right.
Any lawyer worth their salt would. And so the DA got it wrong. Certainly the law enforcement officers should have known better, but the district attorney's job is to review or grade their paper, if you will. And in this case, it flew right through.
Now, my next question, why an indictment for just a misdemeanor charge of official oppression? Representative Dutton, you mentioned the other case in Dallas. In that case, the officer was indicted for sexual assault.
Right.
So in this case, Kim Ogg, why not a more serious charge like sexual assault or sexual battery?
It's often within the discretion of the district attorney. It's always within the discretion of the district attorney to determine what evidence goes before a grand jury and what evidence is withheld. And then the secrecy of the grand jury proceeding under Texas law allows district attorneys never to tell what was presented, what went on. In fact, the public is never allowed to know. So we'll never know what evidence was taken in front of the grand jury and what evidence was withheld. But it doesn't make sense, the disparity in the accountability of felony sexual assault in Dallas by a local DA, yet only a misdemeanor charge here. Again, it shows, I think, favoritism, and while the sheriff is angry at the district attorney, it still shows that they were not prosecuted to the full extent of the law nor held accountable in the way that others have been in similar situations around Texas.
I think your question also invites the consideration of whether or not official oppression ought to be a misdemeanor. I mean, that's what I think. I think that's where the fault lies. I think when a police officer engages in official oppression, clearly what they've done is violate someone's constitutional right. And as a consequence, it ought not be a misdemeanor. It ought to be a felony to start with. Because I think when police officers engage in certain conduct, they certainly know the consequences themselves. And I just suspect that, when we start talking about grand juries, we change the way grand juries are made up. But I will say this, our whole system of grand juries came from England. They spent 550 years trying to straighten it out and finally figured out that we got to do away with it altogether. So now they don't have grand juries anymore. And I think that's where we're marching along rather slowly, because I think having a 3-judge magistrates court to determine probable cause would be far better for our system of jurisprudence than having grand juries, because now I've got to go back and in the legislature introduce a bill so that people who are selected for grand jury don't get terminated. Because apparently somebody's come and said, well, their employer said, well, if you go on this grand jury, I'm going to have to let you go. Well, that doesn't make sense either. And so now we got to protect the people who are serving on grand jury. And as we take a look at all these ways in which to try to improve the grand jury, I suspect that, I hope it doesn't take us 550 years, but I hope we can learn from the experience of other countries that there may be a better way to do this.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about dealing with officers' conduct in terms of discipline that happens within the office. According to the Houston Chronicle, the 2 officers that were indicted are now serving civilian duties, still working for the sheriff's office. So, Ed Gonzalez, does the sheriff have anything to do with the decision to just simply put them on civilian duty, or why not just terminate them?
Yeah, well, officers enjoy many protections as far as their jobs, and so sometimes based on policy, they're allowed while an investigation is taking place for them to be allowed to remain on the job and maybe in a different position or a different kind of in a holding pattern, if you will, while the investigation is terminated, just so that they could have due process as well to make sure that they're stating their side of it and communicating in terms of what was violated, what kind of policies, departmental policies were violated, and while they were indicted, they still have a right to, have their day in court and what have you before any final determination is made. So before, it's kind of not putting the cart before the horse, if you will. So sometimes they're allowed to go through that process before they would be terminated.
Okay, well, let's shift gears a little bit now, and I want to talk about medical marijuana legislation in the upcoming Texas legislature. Now, last year, the Texas Compassionate Use Act was passed and signed into law, and this law is only for epilepsy patients. And the bill allows a very limited usage for CBD oil, and it has to be no more than 0.5% THC, and it has to be at least 10% CBD. So in other words, it's a 20-to-1 ratio of THC to CBD. So that's a limitation on the actual dosage of the medicine that was determined by the people who drafted the bill and passed the bill. So the problem with this is that a lot of epilepsy patients, they'll use a product with a little bit more THC in it. So maybe it's a 15-to-1 ratio or a 10-to-1 ratio or even a 1-to-1 ratio. And also the CBD oil seems to work very well for preventing seizures. But a lot of times when a child is having a seizure, and I've talked to patients who have children with epilepsy who have already moved to Colorado and can't come back even under this bill, they'll use a drop of THC oil and that'll just stop the seizure in its tracks. Now this is not the THC that will get you high. This is a THC oil that's uncarboxylated THC, so it actually doesn't really get the child high. It's just a drop under their tongue if they have a seizure and it stops it. So the problem really is that a lot of patients can't move back to Texas because they can't get the medicine with the dosage they need under this bill. And it doesn't allow for any other debilitating conditions. Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, cancer patients won't really benefit from this. And nobody has really benefited from it as of yet because it hasn't even really gone into effect. So going into the next legislative session, there's going to be efforts to improve the bill, expand it, add more debilitating conditions, take away the limitation on dosage that limits the bill. And I just want to ask for Representative Pena, with improving the medical marijuana legislation that you have, what do you think is a good strategy for doing that and building support for that as far as either expanding the Compassionate Use Act or introducing new legislation?
Well, personally, I would think that we would have to introduce legislation that would increase the amounts for some of the older patients, because it's my understanding when we introduced that bill, Susan clicked it, was that it was for children, because there's nothing for children who go into a seizure or who have epilepsy. There's no medication that could be given to them. But there's nothing that allows it to increase as the child gets older. The child gets older, 14, 15, now what do? You can't increase the doses. So we may have to look at doing that, or that would allow that to happen. But that's about one of the things that I would personally think about, because it is something that I'm familiar with.
Do you see in the future more Republican lawmakers like yourself getting on board and supporting this in future sessions?
I think I do. I mean, I was one of those that was completely against it. I mean, I grew up, don't do drugs. But as I've looked and seen the different effects that it does have, or how it does help someone who has seizures, I've said, okay, well, it's a lot better than trying to buy prescription medicine that's costing you $500 or something for a 30-day supply of medication that's going to, prevent the seizures.
Right. Representative Dutton, you've experienced introducing legislation and trying to garner support for it and going through the process of the committee hearings and the calendars committee and all these hurdles that come up. What do you see as a strategy in terms of medical marijuana or improving the program that we have next session? Where do you see some of our biggest hurdles?
Well, trying to pass marijuana legislation in Texas is akin to trying to clean the Statue of Liberty by licking on it. It has been a difficult challenge, but when I started this back in 2003, I think it was, nobody did it. Everybody looked at me and thought I was crazy, saying, "Wait a minute, you're going to do what?" And I said, "Well, look, we're going to lower the penalties for having an ounce or less of marijuana." Bill never got a hearing. The committee chairman wouldn't even give me a hearing on the bill. Now, during the last session, we had another legislator who proposed a similar bill, and then we had another legislator, a Republican legislator, who proposed just taking all the things off marijuana, just leave it on. His idea was that God created it, so it must be all right. and so we're moving along in a direction that I think ultimately will result in having us take a better look and have laws that are more akin to what the public really wants. But I don't think, I think having the medical marijuana take a course is probably a march toward completely taking all the stuff off marijuana. But I don't think it happens next session. I think you're still going to have enough in the way of opposition to it. There's still some people. I was talking to a DA recently in a case I had, and I brought it up to her, and she said, well, she still thinks marijuana is a gateway drug. I thought, why? She says, well, because every time we find somebody that has all these other drugs, that means we find some marijuana. I said, well, when I was growing up, the guy who sold marijuana just sold marijuana. The guy who sold all these other things just sold that. I said, but now they've taken the supermarket approach and said, look, you just come over here for all of it. I mean, I don't think it means you got a gateway, that marijuana is necessarily a gateway drug. I think that, she's kind of missing the point in that. But I do think it's going to take a while for us to get legislators educated to the point where they recognize that the cost of it, I think as Kim Ogg mentioned when she started, the cost of it, the debilitating cost and the effect on young people's lives is it worth it to us to do that? I say no.
Right, and it seems like some of the biggest concerns we see are, number one, like you said, the gateway drug. And the other one is, what about youth accessing marijuana? And what we've seen in states that have legalized is youth access has not increased. It's stayed about the same. What we've actually seen is that usage among senior citizens has increased. I don't think that's a bad thing.
I was in Seattle 2 years ago, and so I decided I would do my own tour of Seattle. I went over to there's a place in Seattle called Uncle Ike's where it's a marijuana store, and so I went over and introduced myself to the owner, and so I stood there and watched for over about 2 or 3 hours, just watching the people who came in. What was interesting was they were not the millennials that were coming into the store. It was all the other folks who were coming. And so I asked the owner, I said, well, what happened? I thought this is not what I thought would be the case. I thought you'd have lots of young people in here buying marijuana. No, these are older people all coming in and driving up and purchasing marijuana. And he said, I think the young people are still buying from the street dealers. And so they haven't stopped. They haven't decided that they would go to the stores. Of course, the biggest problem you've got with that is what happened this week. I think the federal government decided not to take it off the Schedule 1 list. And so as a consequence, you've got problems. In fact, at one of the conferences I just left, there was a big discussion because the banks will not take the money from the marijuana industry because of the problem with the feds. And what you have now is a number of these marijuana stores that have huge amounts of cash, which now they have become the victims of robberies and things. And so as long as the feds keep it as a Schedule 1 drug, it makes it difficult, but that's going to also influence what happens here in Texas.
Right. And I want to just go back to the gateway theory just for a second, because what I was going to say about that was that I've had a lot of people actually tell me that marijuana is an exit drug. So being the opposite of a gateway drug, it's something that has helped them get off of alcohol addiction, or studies have shown that it helps with people get off of opiate addictions. And thinking of it in terms of an exit drug, that kind of makes sense because especially, we're seeing with senior citizens who take a lot of prescriptions, it's helping wean them off, some of the prescriptions that they take. So I want to address also some of the opposition that we come across in the legislature. And the biggest opposition that we face in Austin is the Sheriff's Association of Texas. So last year, they were opposed any kind of marijuana reform whatsoever. They were even opposed to the Compassionate Use Act, just the CBD oil bill. And this was a lot of these efforts were headed up by Sheriff Will Travis of Denton County. and he put forth a resolution within the Sheriff's Association to oppose any kind of marijuana reform, to lobby against it. Now, thankfully, Will Travis was defeated in his primary, so he's not going to be a sheriff next session. So, Ed Gonzalez, if elected sheriff, would you oppose resolutions within the Sheriff's Association to actively go to Austin and lobby against any kind of marijuana reform at all?
I would oppose that, and I think being the sheriff of Harris County, the largest county in the state, third largest in the country, carries a lot of weight, and that's why I spoke earlier. We need a new generation of leaders that are willing to take those positions and to listen to the constituents, not our own biases or the old way of doing things. And in law enforcement, many times we use old models of what we've done before and what's worked. And I think we need new perspective. We need visionary leaders. And I just think it's a failed policy. Again, I think we have limited budgets. People want to make sure that they're safe, that we're focusing on the things that we need to be doing. And as I mentioned earlier, law enforcement, there's certain things that just don't have a law enforcement solution. And I think that we need to be more forward thinking. So,
And I think that, I was going to just add this, that I believe that our real hope in these changes doesn't lie with or whether or not the Sheriff's Association is against it. I think it lies with the people out here in Texas, making our case to them and explaining to them. Most people don't understand it. And when they do understand it, they side with us. They side with us. The Sheriff's Association is pretty powerful, but the thing that I found most interesting is they were opposed to the open carry bill too. And yet it came flying out of the legislature.
Right. Now, I know that not every Texas sheriff supports lobbying against medical marijuana. They probably feel like, you know what, I'd rather be in my county, protecting my county, not traveling to Austin and lobbying against a bill that's for epileptic children, but they did do that last session. Now, not all of them are for that, but what we see is a very small number of people who are in leadership positions within the Sheriff's Association that do this. Why is it that you think that not more sheriffs will speak out about this in opposition to what the leadership is doing?
well, I don't know if it's just plain old peer pressure or just long established relationships. To some extent, when it comes to the sheriff's office, I'm an outsider. I'm HPD born and bred, and coming in as an outsider, having been on city council and now pursuing this position. But I think again, I just think it's just leadership. It's willing to take a look and not use the same lens that we've always looked at things through. We have and that's why it's important. Elections have consequences, and when you elect the right DA, the right sheriff, these issues are so important. Like I mentioned in the beginning, that's why I'm running for reform, not solely on issues such as this, but most importantly, bail reform, mass incarceration, not only on this issue, but a number of issues. Prostitution, for example, that's something that we've got to look at because we're not addressing the core issues. In issues such as driving while intoxicated or drinking alcohol, for example, it's not banned or made illegal or anything in terms of consumption, and that's just as dangerous as anybody possessing small amounts of marijuana or recreational use or medicinal use, but yet prohibition, we seem to still stick with it. So
right, and in comparison to alcohol, I think that what a lot of people don't understand is the way that cannabis affects your body compared to the way alcohol affects your body. So unlike alcohol, marijuana does not have a physical addiction in terms of it's not going to cause a serious physical withdrawal when you stop. Unlike alcohol, marijuana is not going to damage your digestive system or your liver or your esophagus or lead to potential cancers in your digestive system. Marijuana is not a depressant of the central nervous system, so it's not going to cause you to not be able to walk or talk. And it's not going to depress your central nervous system to the point where you die from poisoning, the way that people die from alcohol poisoning. So there's so many differences. Marijuana acts on the cannabinoid receptors that are in your body. So it doesn't suppress the central nervous system. So our bodies break it down much more easily than alcohol. And a lot of people don't really understand those differences. They just see, this drug gets you high, this drug gets you high, and they don't really see the actual difference in the ways that it affects people. And I think that's important to note, being, how widely accepted alcohol use is and how many problems it causes versus marijuana and the recreational use of that.
And Jason, if I could also just point out to your question about the opposition, or why do some kind of go along to get along, maybe. To some extent, obviously, I'm speaking from a Latino perspective, and when you look at the disparities in incarceration throughout the years, it's disproportionately impacted primarily African Americans, but also the Latino community, and we have to speak out on those issues, okay? Because it's a real thing. It's my community, other communities that are being destroyed because it's difficult to get financial aid afterwards. It's difficult to maybe get employment, housing, so many other factors that impact just beyond just that single arrest maybe. And so that's why we don't have a choice but to speak out about these issues and speak truth about it and hope that the general public supports. And I know probably a lot of, you do polling on this, I'm sure would show that the vast majority of citizens probably support it once they understand the issue. So again, that's another angle why we have to speak up. We have a moral obligation to speak out because communities are being broken.
Yes, absolutely. Now, 2 years ago, the Harris County District Attorney's Office launched the First Chance Intervention Program to allow first-time offenders to be able to avoid an arrest and a criminal charge if they possess less than 2 ounces of marijuana. It started as a pilot program and only 2 law enforcement agencies were participating, but then in January, the DA's office expanded the program and now is asking every law enforcement agency to participate in this, where basically if you get caught with less than 2 ounces, they take your fingerprints, they let you go, and you basically do a little bit of community service and you never get charged. It's a program that's supposed to be pre-charge. So, Kim Ogg, what do you think are some of the flaws in this program and ways that dealing with misdemeanor marijuana, whether it's a first offender or not, that we can actually improve that in the district attorney's office?
Well, the biggest flaw in the program is that it was a complete about-face for our district attorney, and it was a political response to a proposal that I put forth to the public as the Democratic nominee to stop jailing people, forcing them to pay bail and an attorney and have a criminal record for simple misdemeanor possession of marijuana. Devin Anderson did a about-face, said she'd been working on a similar project, and that became this First Chance program. What we saw in the first year is that basically Caucasian defendants or suspects were being given the program. African American and Latino youth were not being given the program. So regardless of how law enforcement made that split about who was enforcing it, who not, people still went to jail with the program in place. In truth, people are still going to jail. You know, Anderson's response was, let's give first offenders a special program. Well, there are many special programs for first offenders, but the truth is the bulk of people arrested for simple possession of marijuana in Harris County are not first offenders. Only about 2,000 of the 12,000 arrested each year are first offenders. So my program was to help taxpayers have their money spent on serious crime by reducing the money spent on possession of marijuana and divert the small-time marijuana cases to community service. Under Ms. Anderson's program, only 2,000 people get the benefit of her program. They still have an arrest record that must be expunged, and it doesn't help the people who, for the last several generations, have been not just initially given a criminal record, but find themselves trapped in an endless cycle of arrest, incarceration, conviction, just for simple possession. And so it's I called it a Me Too program. It was a political response. It was better than nothing, and I was glad that politically we'd been able to move that ball, the whole discussion about marijuana, and push the opponent that far. But in the end, it doesn't change the simple fact that 10,000 people a year are still going to jail for possession of marijuana. And I'm not sure about the racial disparity in this program, whether it's been eliminated or not. I suspect not. There's so much institutionalized racism in the prosecution and investigation of drug crimes. So I think it's actually a compliment to the campaign that we ran in 2014, all of us, for criminal justice reform. We pushed the other side to do things that in the legislature they wouldn't vote for. But now is the time for political courage. Now is the time for candidates to speak openly about what needs to happen. That's why I'm so proud to run with Ed Gonzalez and the other members here. I'm counting on voters to let their legislators know how they feel by voting for candidates who support decriminalization, non-prosecution. And those votes will be a signal to the legislators who aren't up right now and who aren't of the mind that Representative Dutton is, that the public knows what they want and that they're watching how their representatives vote and that they will be held accountable. And I think a positive vote for the people, those of us candidates who have the wherewithal to get up and say what we believe and fight for it in terms of an election cycle, that the votes for us will signal to other legislators that the time is now for change when it comes to drug prosecution of marijuana.
So if elected, how would your administration in the district attorney's office handle misdemeanor marijuana or even felony, but just whether it's Class A or Class B, how would you handle that specifically from a prosecution standpoint?
Well, in the last 2 years since the 2014 election, I looked at best practices all over the country. And in Brooklyn, the district attorney issued a simple policy statement, a one-page white paper that basically said minorities have suffered the brunt of marijuana prosecution, the cost to taxpayers is unsustainable, and that it was good public policy to end the prosecution of misdemeanor marijuana. And that is exactly the proposal that I have on the table. That's what I've announced to the public. That's my position, that on January the 1st, if I'm elected, that misdemeanor marijuana cases will not be accepted by the Harris County District Attorney. And there's a number of options, what we can do with them. We can work with the city to make them Class C paraphernalia cases. We can work with nonprofits to offer people the chance to give back to their community. We can still hold them accountable, ask them to do community service. But what we don't want to do is strip people of the opportunity to go to school, get or keep a job, and even things such as housing, simple things that everybody needs. They're denied to people with marijuana convictions. So we can end that January the 1st, 2017.
All right, well, that's great to hear. Thank you. I want to talk now a little bit about efforts in the Texas legislature to decriminalize marijuana possession. And we've seen this happen last session. There were several bills that were worked on. One of them was a civil penalty bill, which would basically just make it a $100 civil fine or $250 civil fine, whichever it was. So there was no criminal element to it anymore. At that point, it was just a civil case. They just pay the fine and that's it. And there were other, Dutton, your bill was changing it to a Class C. There were other bills introduced, and one bill to just repeal prohibition altogether, which that's always my position, is just get rid of the prohibition, because that's the only bill that would have really gotten rid of the black market and allowed for actual businesses to get involved and provide safe, quality products, which is, very much what we're in favor of, with NORML, is having a Colorado-type model in Texas eventually. So as far as these decriminalization bills, how do you think next session, whenever these bills get introduced and they go to hearings, what advice would you have? Gilbert Pena, let's start with you. What advice would you have for people who are pushing for those to help with the efforts to move those forward?
Well, they have to be good bills, and it's like Representative Dutton stated. I mean, he introduced the first one in 2003, and they're like, everybody didn't even make it into hearing. Now, in this past session, 11 bills were filed, and some of them they get here heard in committee. And so the advice that I would have going forward is that we're probably going to have to do like State Representative Dave Simpson did, is just open the doors and let's legalize it, because it is hurting us more than it's helping when you look at it long term.
Right, absolutely, and I'm with you on that. And I think the other thing that we need to really look at is industrial hemp, because that's illegal. We can't grow hemp in Texas,
Right.
and
Right.
the way I feel about it as far as hemp is like hemp being illegal. It's like if bamboo were illegal. It's a plant that it's not related to marijuana at all. It's just very loosely a cousin to it, I guess. And we'll hear law enforcement say like, well, if hemp's legal, then they're going to grow marijuana with their hemp, but that's not possible because they cross-pollinate, and that doesn't even work. And actually, the DEA spends so much money eradicating marijuana that just grows wildly, and it's usually just wild hemp that usually left over from the World War II era when the government encouraged us to grow hemp. So I think looking at that industrial hemp, and that's a step towards getting rid of prohibition. And I think those are all things that we need to look at. But Representative Dutton, the same question for you is what advice would we have for people, like people in our audience, to help with pushing those bills forward, and what obstacles you might see next session?
Well, again, I go back to the issue I raised earlier. If you want these bills to pass, if you want this to change, it just seems to me there are more people who have concealed carry of marijuana than concealed carry of guns. And yet the people who like the guns can come to the legislature and get the legislature to do anything and pass it even over the sheriff's opposition, over the university's opposition, and the legislature, the bill came sailing out. I think if you could get all of the people who are affected by this issue to decide that I'm going to get a voter registration card, and I'm going to go and vote, you would see the same changes related to marijuana.
Yep.
But until you do that, though, you're still going to have to do the creepy crawly, where you take an inch at a time, and an inch at a time, and an inch at a time, and maybe in 550 years it'll be legal.
Right. We actually have voter registration cards here with us tonight. So if anybody in the audience who's not registered to vote, Chris can get you registered to vote right here today. So, and I really feel also that like anyone who's ever been to a normal meeting, or anybody who's watching this at home right now, every single person should contact their state rep and have a private conversation with the state rep, state senator, or even just their staff. Just sit down and have a conversation, and that doesn't make you necessarily like a very outspoken, publicly outspoken advocate. A lot of people are afraid because like, oh, my boss will find out I'm advocating for marijuana, and then they'll find out that I smoke it. And, just having a conversation with your rep, that's a private matter. That's something that anybody can do. You just email them and say, hey, I'm one of your constituents. There's an issue that's important to me that I want to talk about. And you sit down for 20 minutes and tell them how you feel about it. So that's what we encourage people to do. We encourage people to get involved in that process and to have those conversations.
I still would rather run into people in Texas who are carrying marijuana than somebody carrying a gun. I mean, and so
it's a lot less scary.
Yes,
it really is.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, but that's the message I think we have to get to people, is that all of the people out there who want the change to happen, there are too many of them just sitting in the stands and not on the field trying to help make it happen. And if they'll get together, if all of us got together who believe in this issue, got together, I mean, the legislature would pass it tomorrow.
And it's like with some of my friends, they're concealed carrying both.
Yeah, right.
All the time.
Right.
Okay, so let's get the audience involved here. If somebody has some a question for one of our guests or more than one of our guests, if you want to come up to the microphone, we can hear your questions. Please keep it to just asking a question, and we want to allow enough time for everybody to be able to do that. So, is anybody ready to go?
Ready.
Okay.
Good evening.
My name is Mark Ash, and I'm a judicial candidate in the Libertarian Party ticket. I'm running for Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. And my question for you, Ms. Ogg, I work as a criminal defense lawyer here in Harris County, and one of the questions I've always had, and one of the problems I've always had with the DA's office is the issue of usability. And I think you've answered my question earlier, that you're saying that any marijuana case that's under 4 ounces, which is what a misdemeanor case is, would not be accepted for the DA's office for formal charges.
That's what I'm saying if it is simple possession. That does not include possession with intent to deliver, driving while in possession, driving under the influence. So while it is a very bold platform position, we've seen a district attorney in Brooklyn do it. Crime did not go up. District attorneys there had a greater chance to spend more time on serious cases, and the public likes it. And that's been ratified by his reelection. And so I think that while it sounds like a bold step, it is important for voters to know that almost all of the marijuana cases, the 12,000 or so filed every year, about 98% are under 2 ounces. And as I'm sure you know,
Yes, I do.
what we see in the courts is that the people who are charged generally have a joint, even a piece of a joint. It's a very small amount that ends up leaving a mark on their life that's indelible. It changes their lives forever. So we are pushing the idea that the public will feel safer if our resources, our very limited law enforcement resources, are used to go after burglars, rapists, robbers, murderers, the people who really endanger us, and that the public will feel better about their children and the exposure that our kids have to the criminal justice system if they know that they're not going to be arrested, jailed, convicted, and have permanent criminal records simply because they use some poor judgment and they are in possession of a small amount of marijuana.
I thank you for that position. And if I may ask one more question for Ed Gonzalez. As a candidate for sheriff, the sheriff's office can choose to tell their officers whether to refer cases to the DA's office if it involves only marijuana. What would your position as a candidate be? Would you recommend to your sheriff's deputies not to refer those cases?
Well, I would hopefully be working closely with DA Ogg to make sure that we're working towards the right policies on both sides. But you know, I would not be in favor of arresting. You know, for similar to what she's saying in terms of these smaller amounts. You know, I just don't believe it's the proper use of resources.
And the last question I have for the two legislatures is the legislation does not define usability. Okay, that's been left up to the courts. And I've seen cases as a criminal defense lawyer that involve 2, 3, and 4 grams in some cases. This is very, very small amounts. And what do you, each of you as legislatures, would you propose defining usability more specifically so that those cases would not be charged, at a minimum those cases would not be charged?
Well, I think the law says now that it's Class B misdemeanor for 2 ounces or less.
That's usable.
Any quantity, yes, any quantity that's 2 ounces or less, which means it could be a seed, a marijuana seed. It would still be a Class B misdemeanor. Would still expose you to a $4,000 fine, a year in jail, 180 days in jail, and on and on and on. But so, I mean, I think we've defined it. We just didn't go far enough because we stopped at Class B misdemeanor in terms of the quantities. I think we ought to extend that to Class C misdemeanors so that if you have 1 ounce or less, it's simply a Class C misdemeanor. You can get a traffic ticket and go on about your business.
Okay,
Right,
you all
thank you
answered
very
my
much.
questions. Thank you.
Another question?
Yes, Representative Dutton or anyone else who cares to respond. I'm Alana Purum from our Houston Heights area. My question is, given that historically, I have been told, The real reason that the word marijuana was invented instead of cannabis was actually to suppress the use of hemp as a usable product. The timber industry, the oil industry felt threatened by the cheaper availability of this material. Our agriculture in Texas could benefit if we allowed the growth of hemp again. Do you feel that perhaps it would be beneficial to the case for medical marijuana, if you will, cannabis, to simultaneously have a bill to legalize hemp?
Well, the simple answer is yes. I think if you take all the controls off marijuana, at the same time we ought to look at hemp. Hemp sort of fell by the. I mean, it was a tag along for the marijuana prohibitions, and so it became just as prohibited in terms of usage among citizens as marijuana did. But I never did understand that either. I don't know why we made hemp such a big deal out of hemp, since it just grows wherever it wants to. And so, but anyway, to answer your question, yes, I think we would take all the.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming. My name is Kara Bonin. I'm the Executive Director of Houston Normal. I'm also a Republican Precinct Chair in Katy for 639. So my first question is for the legislators. Do either of you have any plans to put forth a bill this year to either, like you had started with small amounts of marijuana in the criminal jurisprudence, to push forward towards legalization or expansion of the medical marijuana bill?
Well, the answer is yes. Again, we already have the bill drafted from last session. I have been trying to take a poll among my legislators, people who I knew were absolutely opposed to it. What's interesting is that I am finding now that at least in two cases, the legislators who were absolutely, unalterably opposed to it are now not so opposed to it. I don't know what happened. I can tell you that sometimes during the session, people will be opposed to things, and then it happens to somebody in their family. They call me and they say, "Well, did your bill pass?" And I go, "No, it didn't pass. Remember, you didn't vote for it." So there's that happening. That's going on too. That now, and I won't call their name, but I know one of my good friends, his son was stopped and had half a joint of marijuana, and as a consequence, had to go through that whole thing about what happens when you have half a joint of marijuana. And so we're going to introduce it again, but and we're going to rely on Normal and all the folks from Normal to come and try to help us do it. But I think rather than waiting for the legislative session, we ought to start that conversation with the general public now, so that because legislators, and I know Representative Pena agrees with me on this, that legislators do respond to the people that elect them. If you can come to us, and if that's an issue you absolutely like. I remember two little old ladies came to the legislature a few years ago, and they wanted a bill passed. I happened to pass them in the hall, and they didn't know anything about the legislature. And I told them who to go talk to, and by the time the legislative session ended, they had talked to everybody in the legislature, and people started calling me saying, "Harold, don't send those little old ladies to talk to me again," because they went to and they got their bill passed.
Yeah.
So it can happen. I mean, I don't want you to think that, you come to Austin, you see this huge building and all these legislators with these suits and ties on. They are responsive to the people that elect them.
And I'd like to suggest that the results of the 2014 election and the warmth that the public expressed in terms of ending jailing of misdemeanor marijuana possessors, it was noted. It was noted all around the state. It got some national publicity. And I think that even the most conservative legislators can't ignore the people's will. And it was very clear in the way my proposal was received, in the way my opponent rushed to imitate, at least in part, the program, this first offender program for Harris County, that legislators and people running for political office are seeing the public's desire for decriminalization and even legalization, and especially with medical marijuana. You know, denying people who are getting relief, even any kind of treatment that marijuana would provide or relief would provide. I think that's preying on people's consciousness, and I think that is in the minds of folks running for office. And I think this 2016 election with a sheriff's candidate and a district attorney's candidate, the two top law enforcement positions in Harris County, the largest jurisdiction in Texas, makes a powerful statement. We are supported by voters. Our policies are clear. We have the will to express them and run on these issues, and we're going to see the voters' response. And I think that could signal a big change to legislators.
Did you have anything specific to say?
Well,
I know
like
that the Texas Republican Party passed into their platform that they want to see the medical bill expanded, specifically using terms like whole plant and recommendation by a doctor. So will you play on those terms and pull the party, toe the party line?
Like I stated, I mean, I've been polling my voters. I'm out there block walking now trying to get reelected. And that's been one of the questions I've asked. How do they feel about it? And I think I stated earlier they're a little bit against it at first, but after I explain what we're going to, you know, legalize it and hopefully police it and be able to make sure that our youth do not get a hold of it, because they're going to get a hold of it one way or another. They're getting a hold of it now. And so they need to be probably more informed as to what's going to be the benefits of it, in contrast to what's going through now. And the ones that have gone through it, their son or their niece or nephew's gotten picked up with half a joint, and they're having to go through all this nightmare. They're very receptive. Say, "Oh yes, you need to legalize it. You know, at least get rid of that part."
And there are some people in law enforcement who believe this will put a dent in organized crime. That if laws are relaxed and prosecution is relaxed on marijuana, that we'll be able to target organized crime, the people who are committing murders and robberies, to enforce their ability to run the black market will be impacted. That as we start down the road toward a reasonable approach to marijuana, that will signal to cartels and organized crime that, you know, we're not going to tolerate the kind of violence that now surrounds an industry in question, legal in some states, still illegal in Texas.
Yeah, and we have a system now that's pretty good at finding a joint of marijuana, but I never could figure out why you can't find a ton of marijuana.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kara.
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm Houston Normal Social Media Coordinator, and we do have a question from Facebook Live. It's posed by Daisy. To see the law change, there is federal approval and state approval. They both need to coordinate and collaborate in order to see a change in the law. Because of this, it is all still very fuzzy, and we get stuck in this void of law. What can be done to improve this?
Well, there have been several bills filed in the U.S. Congress, both on the Senate side and the House side, to try to take marijuana out of being a Schedule I drug. And so that effort, I think, is continuing now, at least based on the conversations and the discussions we had just here recently in Chicago. In the state side, we're still going to move, as best we can. It's a political solution we always look for, and sometimes that's not the best. But sometimes you take what you can get, and you take one little step, and you then come back to the next session and take another step.
Yeah, and I can chime in on that as well. I believe the legislation you're talking about in Congress is the Carter's Act.
Yes, right.
That would do that. And what we've seen with this recent decision by the DEA is not going to reschedule or deschedule cannabis. And, we've been, petitioning the DEA on this for decades.
Right.
And the DEA is, and I said this months ago, the DEA is not going to change the schedule on marijuana. They're absolutely the wrong agency to make that determination, because they're biased and they have a vested interest in keeping it Schedule I to justify their bloated budget. So what we've seen is, in reality, in the Controlled Substances Act, that ability is given to the Attorney General. So even I think it was 2 years ago, Obama was asked about this, and President Obama said, well, that should be done through an act of Congress. Well, that's not really true when you read the Controlled Substances Act, because it gives that ability to the Attorney General, and then the Attorney General has delegated it to the DEA.
Right.
And the DEA, like I said, they are just absolutely the wrong agency to make that determination. They're never going to change the schedule. It's never going to happen as long as the DEA are the ones to decide that. But in justifying their decision, it's getting a little bit harder for them to justify this. You know, they're having to be a little bit more creative. But this time what they've said is that, well, because it's not FDA approved.
Right.
And when you look at the FDA, marijuana is a plant. It's a botanical. FDA does not approve botanicals. So looking at this, you know, the way it should be treated, a Schedule I drug by definition is something that has absolutely no medical value whatsoever.
Treats marijuana like it treats heroin.
Right, it has a high potential for abuse. Now, I mean, in reality, alcohol is the textbook definition of what a Schedule I drug is supposed to be. Marijuana is not. It doesn't really meet that classification because it does have medical uses, and it's not as dangerous from an abuse perspective. So with alcohol and tobacco, they're not scheduled at all. The individual states deal with those, and then marijuana should be the same way.
Well, at least the report I got was that Secretary Clinton has said that if she's elected president, that she's going to make, one of the things she's going to do is make sure that marijuana is no longer a Schedule I drug.
We'll see.
And so I have to take her at her word right now, so we'll see what happens.
We have another question?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Yeah, I'm Dean Becker, a reporter for Pacifica here in Houston. I got two quick things I want to share with you. This past year, a lady from Tennessee contacted me. Her brother is dying in Galveston, 85 years old, liver, bone, brain cancer, and she thought cannabis might help him. And through some miracle I won't explain, he was able to obtain some cookies and some cannabis. And they said he couldn't smoke, but the cookies did him good. He died on the living room floor playing with his grandkids. And the whole family told me that the great-grandfather had no idea where to get it. His daughter could, with some effort, had done it in the past. His granddaughter could get it on a daily basis, and the great-grandson who lived down the hall had it in his room. It's an example that people do not talk about this. They're afraid to.
Right.
Secondarily, your opponents fear this issue. They fear coming on my radio show. Nobody can explain this drug war. It has no nexus with reality. And I just think you guys are brave, and I appreciate you being here. And just keep it up.
Thanks, Dean.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Greer, and I'd just like to first say thanks for all of you for being here tonight. I have two somewhat related questions. The first one for Mr. Gonzalez and Ms. Ogg related to law enforcement. If you could speak a little bit about any financial incentives that you see built into the system to encourage law enforcement to continue their opposition. And then also for the legislators, if they see any evidence of hard lobbying by, say, big alcohol or tobacco, in the same way that I'm sure the NRA had a lot to do with passing the gun law here, if you guys see anything like that going on. Thanks.
I think in terms of cost, the first thing that came to mind is when we're not able to manage our population, as is the current case, with an average of 9,300 inmates per day, we're having to farm out and go to private prisons. And so we're paying money. So there is a profit system there, if you will, where it supports a private prison system that's very lucrative. And, so for me, we got to manage the population and decrease the number of people that we're incarcerating. To me, it's a simple fix in that case. We just got to think outside the box, and we've talked about some of the options there. And so that's the first thing that comes to mind. It's just the money factor, behind it, and it's the way of doing things. But we've tried the war on drugs now for 40 years, and we have a broken system. Look what's happening south of the border when you look at the amount of demand that we have in this country. And I think we have to rethink how we do things. When you talk about addiction, again, there's no law enforcement solution. To me, it should be community-based. We should look at drug treatment and other options like that, not incarceration. It's way too costly, and it supports a bloated broken system when you look at the entire criminal justice system, when you look at the cost of the judicial side, the attorneys, and again, a lot of people just waiting bond. We've had inmates died inside the jail waiting for bond on a misdemeanor this year. And so the jail's not the proper place to be addressing these issues. We need new leadership on these issues.
Well, with mass incarceration, every time in Harris County a person is arrested and booked into the Harris County Jail, our district attorney and our judges deny pretrial bonds. So the only way to get out of jail is through a surety bond, through a bail bondsman. Mm-hmm. And so the bail bond industry is making money on the prosecution of 12,000 cases of marijuana possession simple every year. And even with this first chance offender program, not everybody is getting it. People are still going to jail, not even the ones who are first offenders. So the bail bond industry, it's no surprise that they support the incumbent judges and district attorney who've for years denied PR bonds, even to people who are completely indigent and can't pay a bail bondsman. And so we have people awaiting trial by the thousands who die in a Harris County jail right now, run by a sheriff that is known for, his jail is being known for abuse, neglect, mistreatment. It's got to stop. And so the question about money is always a good one. Follow the money. That's our training in criminal justice many times. And I think that you get the answers when you see who's making money off prosecution of simple possession of marijuana.
Right. Well, let me just add one thing too. After the last redistricting cycle, I looked on my list of precincts, and I had a precinct that had 7,000 voters in it. And I couldn't figure out where it was. And then when I really took a look at it, it was the Harris County Jail. And I couldn't figure out, okay, so I got 7,000. So I went and talked to the sheriff at the time. Turns out there are approximately 8,500 people in the Harris County Jail on Election Day, 7,000 of whom are eligible to vote. And so I decided to follow a bill that said they could do same-day voter registration because most of them are not there. They have an 85% turnover rate every 30 days. I said, so if you want judges to let people out without bail, just give them the right to vote. And if you get 7,000 of them voting, the judges won't be inclined to send them and to let them stay in jail very long. But again, I don't see very much in the way of the alcohol industry or anybody else actually coming to the legislature trying to keep us from passing marijuana laws. I think the sheriffs law enforcement have been generally opposed to it, but I think they've been opposed to it, which is not in sync with the general public. But the general public has not been engaged in this whole exercise. The general public has basically sat silent, sat quiet, until something happens to one of their relatives, their son, their daughter, or their cousin, or their nephew, or their grandchild. Then they get engaged, and they get involved at that point. And I'm like, well, they said, Mr. Dutton, why do y'all let them do that? I said, well, I didn't let them do it, you did it.
We want to get them engaged. We want to get more people engaged. Well, I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out. For me, you guys, you completely have my support. We want to get voters, educated on what your positions are, and I think we've done that tonight. And I'm really happy with the way this went. And thank you for everybody who came out into the audience. And I just want to close with saying that, in Texas, unfortunately, a lot of the conversation about marijuana reform, it really kind of is focused on criminal justice reform. And I feel that's unfortunate because marijuana itself should not be dealt with as a criminal justice issue. Now, when we talk about the war on drugs in general, Normal doesn't have a position on other drugs, but just me personally, when it comes to dealing with other drugs, we can talk about things like criminal justice reform, we can talk about decriminalization, we can talk about drug courts, treatment instead of incarceration, or more importantly, we should be talking about harm reduction as well. We can talk about getting rid of mandatory minimums, asset forfeiture reform. We can talk about all of those things, but when it comes to cannabis specifically, The only thing we should be talking about is repealing prohibition altogether, get it out of the criminal justice system entirely, and deal with it in a way where legitimate businesses can provide a legitimate product to consumers. There's age restrictions, so youth cannot access it so easily. There's consumer protections. There's taxation and money from that going into education and going into harm reduction. And so people can be aware, and people can be aware of what the plan is and what kind of product it is, and what potential issues they need to be aware of for that, and talk to their children about, and deal with it as a community, as opposed to with a sword and hammer like we have. So I think that's important, and I'm glad for everybody who's made it out here tonight. And that concludes our program. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
After party.
Will there be any smoking? Oh, how you doing? Didn't know you was a normal folk. Good. Steve, what's up, buddy?
So, like, their